Presentation from the Center on the Future of War here at Arizona State University in the School of Politics and Global Studies. This is part of our fall speaker series. We're really thrilled tonight to have our colleague G.L.A. Harris from Thunderbird School of Global Management presenting a talk with a pretty thoughtful title, Women in War, Are They Incompatible? So really briefly, a little bit of housekeeping. I'll present a short bio of our colleague, Gigi Harris, and then she'll do her presentation. And after that, we'll break for a Q&A session. So the way to present questions in our Q&A session is to type them into the Zoom Q&A box. I'm sure you're generally familiar with that, but you'll figure it out, I think, if you are not familiar. And I'll play the role of moderating the Q&A. And please, present as thoughtful and probing questions as you have. So very briefly, the Center on the Future of War is a partnership between ASU and a think tank in DC called New America. We've been doing this for a number of years now. We are involved in research projects, work with students. We run an online master's degree, an MA in global security. We run major events of various kinds in DC and Arizona, quite a few now on Zoom. And many of you are familiar with our work. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. You can contact me personally on my email. And again, we're thrilled tonight to have G.L.A. Harris with us. She is the Senior Associate Dean of Strategic Initiatives, as well as a professor at ASU's Thunderbird School of Global Management. Previously, she was a professor at Portland State University, as well as a senior commissioned officer in the U.S. Air Force Reserve. Her research focuses on gender equity, civil rights, and women in the military and in women in armed conflict. She's the author of Women of Color in Leadership, Taking Their Rightful Place, Living Legends in Full Agency, Implications of Repealing the Combat Exclusion Policy. So for those of you who follow this, there's been quite a significant changes in women in U.S. armed forces and women now involved directly in combat. And women veterans, Lifting the Veil of Invisibility, and Blacks in the Military and Beyond. Her research has led to the creation of the Veterans Resource Center in Oregon, a VRC, and has also helped establish prototype legislation for VRCs at other universities. She has a Ph.D. from Rutgers and is a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Air Force's junior, intermediate, and senior officer schools, including the Air War College. So again, we're thrilled to have Gigi Harris with us today. I'll turn the floor over to you, and thank you all for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Daniel. Before I begin, I would like to thank Daniel and Rothenberg and his staff, as well as the Center for the Future of War in the School of Politics and Global Studies. I would also like to thank Dean Kagram, as well as the Deputy Dean, T. Garden, at the Thunderbird School of Global Management for supporting me in this endeavor. So let's begin. So when I was asked, or maybe I volunteered, to do this talk, I asked Daniel as to whether or not I should concentrate primarily on the United States military or on women generally in the world. And he advised me to concentrate basically globally, which actually makes sense. So I decided to frame my topic as Women in War, Are They Incompatible? So when you think, are women, the first thing is, are women and the military compatible? When you think of women, regrettably, you think of words like supporters, caretakers, nurturers, weakness, and even sex fiends. And in fact, women are perceived as having a biological predisposition to war. That is, it is the belief that they do not have the necessary aggression to go to war, number one. And number two, they get pregnant, so they cannot be in war. Not only that, Adams talks about some of the cultural proclivities that may or may not prevent women from being in war. So for instance, there are two concepts. One is called matrilocal marital residency and patrilocal marital residency, according to Ember and Ember, and also Adams. So matrilocal marital residency simply refers to when the husband resides with his wife and is near the relatives of the wife. Now, there might be warfare because of cultural mores and the like, whereas patrilocal marital residency refers to when the wife resides with her husband and his family. Interestingly enough, warfare is likely to break out when there is patrilocal marital residency because the wife experiences a conflict of interest because of the values of her husband as well as the relatives, her relatives who are men. So as a result, warfare is more likely to break out, which is interesting. According to Grant DePaul, who has done extensive research on women and their engagement in war, she believes that the military and therefore war and women are inextricably linked. I, through my research, do believe that women are warriors to the core. Others, like Goldstein, describe the propensity that women have with the military and war. So, for instance, when you look at women in Egypt during the 13th century, where women are in chariots as riders, even Ramses II of Egypt, he seems to strike a very effeminate pose, which is interesting. And then also when you look at the chariot riders, when you look at their feet, around their ankles, they tend to be adorned with jewelry, which really indicates that for the most part, they're women. Ironically, because chariot riders who are very skillful in their targets of the enemies or of their enemies, it was considered to be a very costly resource. And as a result, gender was not necessarily a consideration. However, it appeared that, and I say it appeared because much of the work to some degree is conjecture, but it appeared that women were more likely to be selected because of their propensity to be more accurate than the men, which is interesting. And as I said, Ramses II of Egypt, not that he is considered to be a female, but based upon the framing or based upon the, not photographs, but based upon the depictions of him, he seems again to be very effeminate or to strike a very feminine or a very effeminate pose. So let's come all the way to contemporary times. So Mazur talks about what is called the novelty effect. And the reason why she talks about the novelty effect is because women, at least today, whenever they seem to engage in milieus where they're not necessarily or traditionally have been seen, it's considered a novelty. And really, according to Mazur, this is largely driven by the media. And Mazur really debunks this notion because, for instance, from the 1960s through 1988, the Air Force, for instance, had women in underground bunkers throughout the United States. And their role was as missileers to thwart the nuclear warheads of Russia. This was during the Cold War period. So one of the things that Mazur is saying is, it is really important that women achieve full agency. By full agency, she means, for instance, there are three notions. One is those individuals on the right believe that women do not belong in the military, period. Why? Because the military is going to be effeminized by the presence of women, whereas those on the left believe that because women are in the military, they're basically treated as second-class citizens. And as a result, because of the hyper masculinity that is experienced in the military. What Mazur, in terms of the novelty effect, is saying, and as a result, she uses what is called agency theory, is that women must be responsible for themselves. They must take full responsibility to shed this cloak of victimhood. I devised what is called theory of attrition. I was looking at white women and white women in terms of their attrition? And why is it that, particularly with the US military, why white women are more likely than any other group to prematurely attrit from the military? And what I discovered that there were several factors that compounded that problem: sexual assault, sexual harassment, deployments, and the like, the assignments that they were given. Interestingly enough, this was pre-combat exclusion policy, which basically prevents women at the time, or prevented women at the time, from pursuing certain occupations. And what I discovered is that even though white females as a group were the most likely of any group or any segment of the military to prematurely attrit from the military, they were the most likely to support repealing the combat exclusion policy. But what's interesting with white women, according to my research, is that unlike other groups, whether it's Black women, Hispanic women, other women, indigenous women, for instance, they have the choice to leave the military because they can. The military, for other groups, underrepresented groups particularly, represents an equalizing, if you will, of the field, the playing field. I also developed a theory of multiple marginality, in the sense that women have to negotiate the different identities, and because they have to negotiate their different identities, they find themselves being marginalized multiply. So for instance, women are placed in certain occupations. Women are asked to do certain administrative tasks, whereas men aren't. They're chosen basically on their gender or their sex. So the theory of multiple marginality is saying they're already marginalized as women, and then you select them for occupations or jobs or duties or tasks that basically remarginalizes them. And as a result, this would be the theory of multiple marginality, to name a few, actually. So who has a monopoly on warfare? The literature suggests, for instance, that there is an intersectionality between culture and biological factors that reinforce women as hunter-gatherers. So according to Adams, as I said before, that women are more likely not to engage in war because, unlike men, they do get pregnant. So in terms of war then, who actually gets credit for doing war? If you are a commissioned officer, for instance, and you have ever been trained in any of the schools, whether it's Squadron Officer School, Air Command and Staff College, Air War College, you're going to be immersed in literature that was supposedly written by Karl von Clausewitz. And the title of this 10-volume piece about the principles of war and strategy is called On War. Now, interestingly enough, Karl von Clausewitz actually got credit for writing the so-called masterpiece. But little did we know, Elshane actually introduced or inserted some doubt in that, because it was following Clausewitz's death, Karl's death, that this piece was actually compiled. And Marie von Clausewitz's wife, or Marie von Breuer, she was only given credit for doing the preface when she actually compiled and edited the entire masterpiece. So basically, it is not inconceivable that the entire book was written by her, given her husband, who was a general in the Prussian army, and his exploits, the sentiments of the times. She felt that she was a dutiful wife supporting her husband. And this it also could have been an ode to honor and preserve Karl's background, legacy, and the like. So when she was posed, when she was asked what really went into the writing or the editing of this 10-volume piece. She replied, nevertheless, their publication called for a good deal of work, arranging of material and consultation, and I'm profoundly grateful to several loyal friends for their assistance in this task. Basically, again, L. Shane inserts doubt that it really wasn't Carl who actually wrote this masterpiece. It was actually his wife, Marie. So let's look at, throughout Austria, as I would say, or Persian Street, the powerful women of ancient times. So let's look at women leaders. Women leaders during ancient times have demonstrated gravitas to intimidate any man who dared to cross them or was considered a warlord at the time. As heads of state, they exercised strategy and savvy, and political savvy. They engaged in territorial expansion, they wielded influence, they embroiled their countries in wars, and they did all of this to concentrate power. Now, Alan talks about Africa, the continent, as the mother of all nations. He said that it produced the Amazons of North Africa and Sahara. The Sahara Desert is a very large area. In fact, it's the largest desert of its kind. And it's comprised of countries like Niger, Mauritania, Mali, Egypt, Algeria, and so many more. And basically, these Amazons of Africa, they were the descendants, their descendants, the Greek Scythians, was a matriarchal society where women freely assumed roles on par with men. In other words, women, like men, engaged in war. The first recorded case of women in war, actually, there was a grave that was discovered in Sudan of a woman called Jebel or Jebel Sahaba. This was about 6,500 BC. And moreover with that, you also have Queen Shemamarat of Assyria. And of Assyria, we have, which today consists of parts of Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. And she ruled around 9th century BC. She commemorated a bronze statue to herself and of her exploits, as any warlord, male or female at the time, would have done. And in the inscription in this particular bronze statue, it said, quote, "Nature made me a woman, yet I've raised myself to rival the greatest men. I swayed the scepter of Minos. I extended my dominions to the river Heramines eastward, to the southward, to the land of frankincense and myrrh, northward to Sake and the Scythians, which are the Greeks. No Assyrian before me had ever seen an ocean, but I have seen four. I have built dams and fertilized the barren land with my rivers. I have built impregnable walls and roads to far places, and with iron cut passages through mountains where previously even wild animals could not pass. Various as were my deeds, I have yet found leisure hours to indulge myself with friends." This was recorded by Herodotus. Herodotus was considered to be the first historian. He was Greek. Other notable heads of state, we look at Queen Hatshepsut. She was considered the consummate businesswoman. She multiplied her domain through expansion. As I said before about the chariots of Egypt, they were very skillful, and they were selected not necessarily based upon their sex, but based upon their skill. The irony is these very warrior queens sometimes donned male articles, such as beards, and this was supposedly to evoke symbols of wisdom of the pharaohs, so to speak. Now, there's also a long line of Ethiopian queens with lands that stretch from Ethiopia today, which would be considered Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, and parts of Egypt. let me talk about one very formidable foe that Alexander the Great encountered. And he called her Black Queen Candace. She was very powerful. She was very adroit in her execution and expansion of lands. She had great power. And when Alexander encountered her, he realized that she amassed such a force of 70,000 strong because she was known to be unrivaled for her strategy as a commander. And she ruled pre-332 BC. And he knew that if his forces came up against her, she would have dealt his force a damning blow. So he basically succumbed to her. And when we look at Queen Ananatu, who ruled the Yoruba and Hausa people with impunity, Queen Ananatu, very difficult to pronounce, she represents one of 17 queens at the time, interestingly enough, most recently as 1536 AD, where the last queen ruled for about 34 years. There was a famous queen though, Queen Zinga Mbandi. She was the daughter of King Ngongo. And the reason why I find her most interesting, she was of royal lineage, of course, and her father was captured by the Portuguese. And so she made a request of the Portuguese to negotiate his release. But then when she visited the castle, she saw the governor and she saw us flanked by two attendants. And she's trying to figure out, okay, he's seated, he's flanked by two attendants standing, where am I going to sit? Well, she knows how important it is in terms of power to negotiate on equal or on par with a rival. What did she do? She ordered one of the servants on all fours and sat on him so that she could be at eye level with this governor, which I found very interesting and very compelling, actually. So let's look at Queen Septima Zenobia. But before we go to Queen Septima Zenobia, let's look at Cleopatra of Egypt. Cleopatra III of Egypt. As you know, she was known for her beauty. She was also known for her seductiveness, if you will. And as a result, she was purported to have had relationships, intimate relationships with both Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. Well, she held such sway over both men that she was also able to convince Mark Antony to give her his holdings, including his land. And as a result, she was suspected of convincing or conspiring with Octavian, who was Mark Antony's brother-in-law, to move the seat of power, this is Rome, to move the seat of power from Rome, Italy, to Alexandria, Egypt, which is where she was born. Well, when she discovered that the secret was found out, Cleopatra III, she decided she did not want to be embarrassed. So to avoid any embarrassment, she really killed herself. And just to avoid that, interestingly enough, still today, she's reviled as a queen. I mentioned her story to show the opposite. Queen Septima Zenobia reigned over Palmyra, which today would be Saudi Arabia, Armenia, Iran, Egypt, Syria, and Syria. And the Roman Aurelian said of the queen, there are Romans who say that I'm waging a war against a mere woman, but there is a great array, sorry for the error there, there's a great array before me as though I were fighting a man. I cannot tell you what a great store of arrows, spears, and stones is here. What great preparation they have made. There is no section of the wall that is not held by 2 or 3 engines of war. Their machines even hurl fire. And Aurelian made repeated overtures to Queen Zenobia in trying to capture her lands. And she refused them because she didn't feel that he was a leader. Well, one night she escaped on a camel. Unfortunately, her plans were thwarted, and she was intercepted before she got into Persia at the time. And when Aurelian asked her, why did she not put up a fight? She said, well, now you have demonstrated that you're a leader. And as a result, interestingly enough, she went on, her part of the family went on to marry Aurelian's family and so on and so forth. Anyway, Aurelian went on to describe the queen, which he described her as, her face was dark and of a swarthy hue. Her eyes were black and powerful, her spirit genuinely great, and her beauty incredible. Her voice was clear and like that of a man. Her sternness, when necessity demanded, was that of a tyrant. Her clemency, when her sense of right called for it, that of a good emperor. Said of Herodotus, as I said, the Greek philosopher and historian, the African continent, as I said before, was a bevy of Amazons and their descendants, the Greeks, the Scythians, who were steppe people, which meant that they were nomads. They freely assumed roles on par to men, but these roles were often reversed. Sometimes they also donned men's clothing when engaging in war. Men primarily functioned as protectors in society, whereas women were the influencers and holders of power. Let's go to Europe. So Helsfred was the daughter of Alfred the Great. She ruled around 878 AD. She forged alliances and married strategically with another royal Saxon family. She was described as a woman who protected men at home and intimidated them abroad. She expanded territory by building forts, convinced the Welsh to cede territory after capturing their king's wife and members of his court. She also seized the Viking military center at Derby. There was also a Matilda of Italy. She was known to be fierce. She was famous for her commanding armies in Europe. Ironically, she was also trained in the finer things of life, like embroidery, but yet she accumulated numerous exploits in combat. Said of Matilda, now there appeared in Lombardy, at the head of her numerous squadrons, the young Matilda, armed like a warrior, and with such bravery, that she made known to the world that courage and valor in mankind is not indeed a matter of sex, but of heart and spirit. Let's continue with the powerful women of Europe. So Frances Eleanor of Aquitaine, she ruled between 1122 AD through 1204 AD. She forged strategic marriages or a marriage with England's Henry II to increase her reach, coalesce power, further her exploits for influence and territory. So you can see here, it really wasn't about love, it was about power, basically. And of course, we're all familiar with Joan of Arc or Joan d'Arc. Before she was age 19, she was basically a peasant girl who rose to influence. She remains a national figure, and she was able to convince Charles the Seventh, or Charles of Valois, to have her command the invasion against Britain solely based on a vision from God. Her mother steeped her in religion, and although she was actually illiterate, she was literate in all things religion. She led France to victory by retaking territory. Unfortunately, her influence over Charles Valois, or Charles of Valois, or Charles VII, it became suspect. As a result, Joan of Arc was branded a heretic for communicating with angels. She was accused of witchcraft, and she was burned at the stake in 1431. at the age of 19. Interestingly enough is that 500 years, almost 500 years later, or around 1920, she was canonized as a saint, or the Maid of Orleans. And because she's still revered in France, and she symbolizes unity, nationalism, and the like. So if women were that powerful, what happened? Well, what happened is between 1095 and the 15th century, there was a slow but deliberate devolution of women's power and influence. And this really began with from the First Crusade on and other crusades. And there was a religious purging, if you will. In fact, at this time, there was the introduction and defense of Christendom or Christianity against the Muslims. And this was probably the first record of what we now call Islamophobia. This was also the so-called Age of Enlightenment. When I say so-called, I say very cynically, because women were no longer part of that milieu, so to speak. There's a heightened sense of intolerance and hyper morality, if you will, particularly by the Christian elite. They felt that women were virtuous, and because women were virtuous, they had no role in military affairs or exploits. So women, because as I said, women were considered to be virtuous. In fact, the presence of women and the support and comfort they rendered were perceived as softening men and making them weak, especially prior to battle. Women were thereby reduced to merely accompanying men on expeditions as pseudo men to render support and comfort, because as you know, women also dressed in male's clothing. So let's look at the American experience, and let's look at some of the notable women warriors. So Lucy Brewer fought in the War of 1812, and Lucy Brewer served in the Marine Corps. She served for 3 years on the USS Constitution as George Baker. Now, how she was not discovered, I don't know, but interestingly enough, the literature shows that women were known to have concealed their identity because they were patriotic enough that they wanted to serve just as their fellow male citizens. So in many respects, they were known to serve, and as a result, there were certain commanders who gave basically a blind eye to what they saw because they needed troops. So Lucy Brewer, as I said, probably lasted that long because they knew, but they didn't reveal that she was a woman. Let's go to Sarah Borguinis. Sarah Borguinis fought during the Mexican offensive at Fort Brown. Sarah Borguinis for the time was unusual. She was a striking, over 6 foot figure. She put her life in danger by holding the offensive and was able to, did such a phenomenal job that General Zachary Taylor commissioned her on the spot to the rank of colonel. So that was interesting. Rosie O'Neill Greenhow, she fought during the Battle of Bull Run during the American Civil War, and she was a socialite. And interestingly enough, though, she fought not for the Union Army, she fought for the Confederate Army by passing intelligence to them. And later on, she was incarcerated, even though the Battle of Bull Run, the Confederate, for that particular part of the war, actually won. Molly Pitcher. Molly Pitcher, it's a fictional name, if you will, because she is thought of to be the wife of John Hayes. John Hayes was a soldier who served in the 7th Pennsylvania Regiment, and she witnessed the mutilation of her husband and his soldiers. And she decided, she held the fort until the artillery came. And unfortunately, she never received any any accolades until 70 years later. Interestingly enough, DePaul said that had she been a man, she would have immediately received those accolades, number one. And number two, if you're from New Jersey, you would know that if you go on the New Jersey Turnpike off exit 7 or 7A, you see the Molly Pitcher rest stop. Right DePaul cynically says that the fact that this woman, this great woman, is consigned to a rest stop is laughable. Let's talk about another great woman, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman she was active during the American Civil War. Harriet Tubman was called, or was dubbed, the Moses of her people. She was enslaved, but escaped slavery. And she was able to, through the Underground Railroad, which, as you know, was a consortium of white abolitionists and freed slaves. And she went back repeatedly to identify with the not identify with the soldiers, but to help the soldiers to get the slaves to freedom. And she did so to her peril. Later on, after the war, she petitioned to the government for pay for her service. She was turned down the first time. The second time, however, she succeeded. And as a consequence, she received $20 each month during her lifetime. And during that time, that was a lot of money, quite frankly. It is also fitting that in 2013, the first known Black president, President Obama, dedicated 480 acres of land in Dorchester County, Maryland, that celebrated her 100, Harriet Tubman's, the 100th anniversary of her death. Hall of Harriet Tubman in 1994, he published, Harriet Tubman was an extraordinary human being and possibly the most underrated and underappreciated person of either sex or any race from the Civil War period. So, because of this so-called Age of Enlightenment, and let's come all the way to today, women are now considered others. There's this othering of women. Women are described as deviants, which means away from the norm or outliers. Frankenberg dubs the term other or subordinate or marginalized. It's also invoked by research by Moscanta, Rosabeth Moscanta. Interestingly enough, what her research shows is that when white women are in organizations and then you have incoming minority women, the fact that they share a sex doesn't necessarily mean that they will integrate. Paisley and Oron in 2001 published a study whereby women in the IDF, the Israeli army, show that because women were a minority or are still a minority, quite frankly, they were under-evaluated simply because of gender or sex. Rosanne Al actually conducted a few more studies, not just 1996 and 1999, but also the US Army conducted studies in 2001 and 2002. And what they discovered is, at least Rosanne Al, he did a meta-analysis of 5 combat support units. This was pre the repeal of the combat exclusion policy. And what he found out was that while the men, the male soldiers enlisted, believed that the women who were coming in the squadrons were not qualified, over time they accepted these women. Here's the irony. The women who were already in those squadrons, while they believed that the women who were now coming into these 5 units, they were equally qualified, the women who were already in these squadrons did not want to work with these women. Why? Because they realized the women, and thus them, were marginalized as a group, and they did not want to be associated with them. That said, these behaviors become self-reinforcing, self-controlling when they themselves, meaning the women, engage in these self-destructive ways. It reinforces what Chadro calls hegemonic masculinity. Claudine Golden even goes further. She dubs it pollution theory, which means that men deliberately prevent women from pursuing or going into certain fields because if they do, they will pollute those occupations. I and my colleagues basically believe that this is akin to a man cave. Now, what we don't understand is if men can retreat to a man cave, what do women retreat to? Which is interesting. Prentice and Carranza, as well as Burgess and Borgida, frames this discrimination in terms of descriptive versus prescriptive stereotypes. Descriptive stereotypes would be what women are, just what they are, their mothers, their maids, etc., etc. Prescriptive stereotypes, however, are those behaviors in which women engage that violate social mores or social norms. And as Ostraika says, quote, a truth universally acknowledged, she speaks of academic women here, that a woman might produce books or babies, but not both. Just as she might organize her life around marriage or career, but not both. So in doing so, unfortunately, women in the military, and in this case, in any military, but particularly the American military, experience a double and in some cases triple jeopardy for themselves. So particularly minority women, underrepresented women, and women themselves are already a minority in the military. Today, as of 2018, women together in all the services represent about 16% of the total representation of the military, the armed forces. Minority women, and particularly underrepresented minority women, there's a difference. We've got minority women and those who are underrepresented, such as indigenous women, individuals who self-report as Hispanics, and African Americans. They experience a double jeopardy in the sense that now they're in a male institution and really a white male institution. And they're also placed in occupations that also just reinforces their marginalization. White males still today are considered the consummate warriors. According to Kerber, this greatly, for women to be in the military, it profoundly disturbs the sexual order. Therefore, the conclusion is, according to some researchers, women in the military are incompatible. Why? These are violations of perceived cultural norms. Myself and my colleagues have said, this reinforces, though, women as deviants and away from the norm. According to Sitow, well, why do women put themselves in those positions where they engage in occupations or secure opportunities in male organizations, particularly white male organizations? Therefore, they're really conceptual men. In the military, as a result, women experience lesbian baiting. As I said before, women experience multiple marginalities given the jobs and the fact that they're women, and particularly if they're minority women, and particularly the fact that they're also in male institutions. And as a result, in the process, according to Silva, women are forced to negotiate multiple identities. Interestingly enough, the military, as many organizations, according to Kozer and Lob Kozer, is described as a greedy institution or greedy institutions because they take every ounce of you and really give nothing back. I was going to say something about the great resignations kind of today, where you have workers today really have the upper hand as opposed to yesteryear where employers really had the say. Anyway, according to Wagner, DeCroo, and even Wesley Segal, particularly women in the United States military, we're seen as a convenient resource. We're to be employed and deployed at will, but we're never going to get the accolades for our performance. the irony is without women, conflicts, major conflicts cannot be won, wars cannot be won. Solaro deduces the treatment of women by the military as akin to how a married man treats his mistress. So the married man makes all different kinds of excuses why during his marriage, he cannot reveal to the world that he's got this affair. Now he divorces. The mistress then goes to him and said, well, now you're free to marry. Well, the married man now makes an excuse that, well, he can't marry, he'll have to think about it. Ironically, the military, in this case, the US military, actually employs the same tactic, where the military resorts to, well, let's study it. The irony is, women have repeatedly demonstrated that without them, wars cannot be won. Yet every time women are deployed and we win wars or major conflicts as a result, when we return, women do not get the accolades that they're entitled to. And as a result, the military over time wants to study it. What I believe is it compromises the true definition of citizenship and what it means really to be a citizen soldier. So are women really perceived as the enemy? Interestingly enough, when you look at the literature, such as that by Jeffries, it shows a culture of masculine domination. It also shows around the world where, for instance, the Pakistani army, before men are asked to engage in battle, the commanders show the men pornography to get them aroused and really now view the enemy as a female. During the Vietnam conflict, whenever American soldiers would engage in untoward behavior, if you will, particularly of a sexual nature, they would deliberately pull their squadron badges and insert it in the private parts of their conquest of the women that they have performed some conquest over, which is unfortunate. In Chang's book about rape of the Nanking, where the Japanese soldiers believed that they were performing the duty as per the emperor and raped both Chinese women and men in the process. Again, when asked why they did what they did, they felt that they represented the emperor, and so they were justified in these very vile acts. According to Kelly and Brown Miller, regrettably, sexual violence against women in the military has been normalized. It's actually, when you look at society around the world, sexual violence against women has been normalized. When you look at though how Linus and the military and the US military, so Linus was purported or is purported to be an experiment by the US military where women are assembled into what are called female engagement teams. This actually occurred during Operations Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan in 2001, and also throughout the war, as well as Operation Iraqi Freedom. The reason why this particular tactic was employed was because of the cultural moorings where men could not touch women and the like. So as a result, female engagement teams or women were used as female engagement teams to do men's bidding, basically. Interestingly enough, I had the opportunity in 2013 through 2014 to actually interview one of those women for my 2015 book. And she was a combat medic, and she was basically drafted into this function without any training at all. She, as a medic, obviously, she was trained for combat to heal wounds for her patients. The only time, according to the military, that someone who is in the health field can actually take up arms is in defense of their patients. She, interestingly enough, was now a full-time medic, combat medic, armed with a gun. You may or may not be familiar with the Marines United. situation where following Defense Secretary Ashton Carter in December of 2015, he's saying you cannot treat half of the population in a democracy as if they're not citizens, and as a result, the previously announced repeal of the combat exclusion policy, which basically excludes women from being combatants, he accelerated. Previously, Liam Panetta, the defense secretary, wanted to give the respective branches of service enough time through May of 2016 to come up with a plan to determine how are they planning to integrate women into these now combat jobs. Well, Secretary Carter, then Secretary Carter, as I said, decided to accelerate the process, and he said from now on, from December of 2015, women were basically considered combatants and they were in all jobs.
Excuse me, Gigi?
Yes.
This is an extraordinary presentation and enormously comprehensive, but because we're getting close to our set time,
oh, you are. We are. Wow.
To give our attendees a chance to ask a few questions, but also if people will bear with us, we can probably, for those who can stay with us, we can extend the session a little bit longer.
Okay.
If you don't mind, maybe we'll just invite our attendees to ask some questions. We have one here from our colleague, Professor Bruce Poggle, retired JAG and a colonel.
Mm-hmm.
Bruce is asking, I'd be interested in your thoughts on sexual assault in the military. It has been a persistent problem, and both civilian and uniformed leadership have failed to identify a coherent solution. Leadership alone is not the answer. Your thoughts?
Well, it's funny. I covered that in my book, Living Legends and Full Agency, Implications of Repealing the Combat Exclusion Policy. There's a chapter that I have about the problems of asymmetry. When you treat any group as subordinate to another, particularly the fact that that group is also a minority, what you're doing is, back to multiple marginality, you're basically reinforcing that subordination. You're basically reinforcing the marginalization of that particular group. So as a result, until not just the repeal of the combat exclusion policy, but until the execution and the implementation of the repeal, not just in rhetoric only, but actually putting women into those jobs and making women or placing women on a playing field, we're still going to have these problems. And in fact, as a result, my book in 2018 really highlights how the backlash of women experiencing sexual assault, sexual harassment, and the like, how when women then transition from active military, whether it's reserve, National Guard, or active duty, and they come out as civilians, the difficulty that they have, in fact, as a result, women's suicide rate, and what's even most disturbing is the fact that women are no longer killing themselves silently, say, taking medication and the like. They're literally taking their lives with the gun.
Please, other folks in the audience who'd like to ask questions, please drop them into the Q&A box. Question here: with the removal of the combat exclusion and the general, at least greater integration of women into the U.S. military, what do you see as essential key strengths, particular qualities that you feel women will bring to, in some cases, these new roles, and in some cases, existing roles? You know, what can we expect to see positive benefits within the U.S. military of these changes?
Well, with the U.S. military, and any military for that matter, women are known for their detail. And that's the reason why, interestingly enough, women serve as missileers and the like during the Cold War. Women do better in certain jobs than men, interestingly enough. So women are selected for those jobs because they're better at doing those jobs. The combat exclusion policy is supposed to remediate this inequality. My concern with the so-called repeal of the combat exclusion policy is the execution. We do a good job in saying that it was repealed. The unfortunate part about that is the fact that as I said, in December of 2015, it was totally repealed. But then we had the Trump administration, and during the Trump administration, things basically stopped. And now the Biden administration, regrettably, is dealing with so much that that may not be a priority right now. So women continue to be in jobs slowly but surely. You've got organizations like the Service Women's Action Network and other organizations who are keeping the fire to the military's feet. But we do not believe that these improvements are being made fast enough. You're on mute, Daniel.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. So another question here is, what lessons you've mentioned that there are a number of militaries in different parts of the world that have integrated women more effectively for greater periods of time than the U.S. military. What are the lessons from other militaries around the world that could be learned by our own armed forces?
Well, it depends upon the military. For example, when I studied the Canadian Armed Forces, when I applied for my protocol for research, they basically asked me to revise everything. Initially, I was perturbed, but they had a method to their madness. They basically wanted to let me know that even though culturally, and because we simply share a border with Canada, that we look alike, it doesn't mean that the Canadian military and the US military are the same. The US military is war-centric. It's about the war fighter. Everybody supports the war fighter. Whereas the Canadian Armed Forces is about humanitarianism, basically. In fact, that's the reason why Canada participated in Operation Enduring Freedom, because they felt it was a justified war, but they failed to contribute to the coalition in Operation Iraqi Freedom because they did not feel that it was justified. What can we learn from other militaries, and particularly the Canadian Armed Forces? As I said, possibly make it less war fighter focused. And as I said, the Canadian Armed Forces is more humanitarian. Many militaries around the world would probably think, well, that's the function of the UN, perhaps. Not necessarily. When you look at some of the NATO forces, that is the take, but not necessarily. I hope I've answered your question.
Do you think it's likely that the U.S. military will make this shift and/or learn from other militaries around the world in this regard?
Yes and no. Colin Gray talks about the American military likes to break things and bring in the bombs from the air. The other militaries of the world tend not to do that. We also think in terms of ourselves as bigger, better, and badder than anybody else. For instance, but at the same time, we're hypocritical in the sense where, I'll give a good example, in 1987, when the American military was teaching the Canadian Armed Forces and other forces elsewhere, teaching its women to fly fighter jets and the like, they were denying their own female workforce from doing the same thing because under the oppressive yoke of the combat exclusion policy. So you see the hypocrisy there. So do we really want to learn from others? I don't know. I think only now, because the military is losing a lot of women, and now we're in peacetime. So whenever there is peacetime and there's a robust economy, the military experiences a problem in recruiting, in promoting, because we don't have the numbers to promote, and retaining those women. And what's happening, and particularly the white female, she's less likely to stay in the military than other demographic groups of women in the military.
So we've reached 6 p.m., but I think because this is such an interesting presentation and conversation, why don't we extend for 5 minutes? My apologies for cutting you off in that presentation. So
that's okay. That's okay.
If you have a minute, if there's some key point that you were getting to that maybe you could present to our audience, and we'll still have time for a question or two before we close out.
Well, I'll just explain one of the bullets. Hunter, who has just a wonderful book called Honor Betrayed, he talks about the greatest threats to women. One, a competent woman a lesbian woman, and a gay man. And what's the common thread through that? Femininity, which is kind of interesting. So my last slide is, women's place in society should be framed as the following. Women in the United States, for instance, represent a little bit more than half of the general civilian population. Women are and have proven to be an invaluable resource. Not only that, it is of a compelling government interest for national security to use the skills of every citizen in a democratic society. It is also a matter of readiness to leverage the full talents of all citizens. Women should, like men, have the right to bear arms as American citizens. It is the right to full agency in society. It is indisputable and consistent stellar performance in the military of women. Women have and continue to exceed performance and commitment expectations to the mission. Therefore, gender or sex should be moot. To meet recruitment, promotion, and retention goals of the military, U.S. military needs everybody. It reinforces the value of democracy. As President Carter once said, equal obligations deserves equal rights. For example, for the U.S. military, as I said before, repealing the combat exclusion policy, which was really repealed in 2015, was the moral and right thing to do. Now the repeal must be fully executed and implemented without delay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. You covered so much ground. Does it question, you've made such a compelling argument as regards the US for the full integration of women in sort of every aspect of the US military and arguably other militaries around the world. But is this then simply a question? Is this an inevitable movement that we will not be able to have this sort of presentation in the near future? Is that inevitable? And if so, what's sort of your sense of a timeline of that sort of transformation?
Well, there's still things to be ironed out. So the repeal of the combat exclusion policy, or the 1948 Women's Integration Act, is just the first part. I don't know if you're aware of there's a lawsuit brought by the National Coalition of Men in 2019 saying that the Selective Service Act that requires that men register when they turn age 18 is unconstitutional because it's in essence a draft. Why aren't women required to? Ironically, they took it, the district court said, yes, it is unconstitutional. They do agree with the men, the NCE, the National Coalition of Men. It then went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that decision and said, well, based upon an early decision in 1980, Ross Kerr versus, now my mind is playing with me. Anyway, Ross Kerr, we cannot, because the decision was made that because women were still considered non-combatants, the Selective Service Act or the Selective Service System could not be repealed. So what they did, though, they said, this is not our decision. It is a decision. They empaneled three judges who basically made the decision that this is not a decision for the Court of Appeals. And if you know anything about the Fifth Circuit, very conservative. This is not a decision for us to make. So they basically kicked the can to the Supreme Court. So it's now in the hands of the Supreme Court. So that really will be the last bastion as to whether or not women, if women are asked like men to register at age 18 to be part of this, we don't call it a draft anymore, but that's basically what it is. Will it happen? Will Congress approve it? Will the American public approve it? It's really subject to public sentiments.
Thank you so much. So we'll continue just for a little bit longer. Here's a question from Abdulaziz Waheli. Why not prioritize structural challenges to overcome the execution problem?
When you say the execution problem, are you talking about the execution problem of phasing the combat exclusion policy
So,
repeal, and
so I'm
that's
not sure from the
Afghanistan.
question as written, but I'm assuming it had, rather than engage solely questions of policy, to what degree is this a reflection of deeper structural conditions that need to be addressed?
And there is, it's really cultural. It definitely is, because the notion still is women shouldn't do certain things. But the only reason why we have changed, like for instance, one admiral said, the sea services, and in this case, submarines, will never be controlled by women. There will never be a female submariner. Guess what? Women are now in submarines, both enlisted and commissioned. So guess what? The only reason why they did that, the U.S. Navy Academy realized that not enough men are graduating with the technical degrees they need to become submariners. But simultaneously, women in the military were now expressing interest in that. And they're the ones who are now pursuing those degrees. So a resource is a resource is a resource, whether it's male or female. And that's the only reason why women are now part of the submarine service. So over time, it will happen because it's really about the numbers. And when the military, kind of like on the ground, when commanders cannot find the number of troops to do what they need to do, they revert to what they need to do. It's about the mission. And if the mission calls that you may be a woman and you're not what have you, well, guess what? You're in the military. I will command you to do what you need to do. It's not illegal, but that's what has to be done.
Final question here from our colleague, Colonel Poggle. In your opinion, what needs to be done in terms of fully implementing the combat exclusion policy? What are the deficiencies?
So the Military Leadership Defense Council, the Defense Committee, the Military Leadership Diversity Committee, which the Obama administration started in, I think it was 2009, as well as DACOWITS, which is the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. They were the ones together that dealt the death blow, if you will, that women should be integrated. There must be a thoughtful process to phase women into these jobs. You cannot have women pursue these jobs without training, as Operation Iraqi Freedom has shown. Yes, you've got women who were placed on the ground, but they were killed or molested or what have you, because they were not trained for those jobs. They were there because of numbers. And numbers, unfortunately, kill people. As not Petraeus, I forgot the name of the commander, said Iraqi freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom, was like a 360-degree war zone. So the military has to be more thoughtful. Not only that, we're losing a lot of senior women, both at the enlisted level and at the commission level. And because we're losing them, who are the ones who will be trained behind them? We don't have the numbers to promote because they're leaving prematurely. As I said before, my own research about white women shows a premature attrition of white women because at least they feel that they have choices. Minority women are less likely to. So we have to find ways to attract women. For instance, the Marines now used to have a cap of 77% women, no more of the force, 7%. Now, when you look at 2020 figures, it's up to 14%. Why? It's about the numbers. It's about the numbers.
Well, thank you so much, Gigi, Professor Harris. Thank you all of those who've stayed with us for this event. We really appreciate your time and interest. It was a wonderful presentation. We learned a lot, and we're really thrilled to work with you and to have you here as a colleague. For those interested, we have another event this week, this Friday at 3 p.m. from 3 to 4 p.m. We'll have Paul Kahn from Yale Law School presenting a talk on America's new Civil War. He's quite an extraordinary thinker, and if you have the time to join us, we'd be thrilled to include you in that conversation. So thank you again.
And if you don't mind, I'd like to say before I leave, thank you again to you and the Center for the Future of War and the School of Politics and Global Studies. Again, I would also like to thank Dean Kagram and the Deputy Dean Teagarden and my colleagues at the Thunderbird School of Global Management for supporting me, as well as I appreciate the viewing audience for supporting me as well and taking the time to attend this session. Thank you all.
Thank you, and good night, everyone.
Good night.